The authenticity angle is tired, Jasmine. Our clients need bolder strategies, my business partner said, dismissing my campaign proposal in front of venture capitalists from Sequoia. The investors leaned forward, interested. My partner, Richard Foster, smiled and opened his tablet. Let me show you the viral activation strategy I've developed for the fintech launch. I sat in the Penthouse conference room in Midtown Manhattan, watching Richard present a social media campaign that was unmistakably mine. The consumer psychology insights were mine. The platform-specific content strategies were mine. Even the influencer partnership framework and budget allocation came directly from research and planning I'd spent 11 months developing and sharing with him during our agency partnership meetings. This was the 17th time in 22 months that Richard had stolen my marketing strategies and presented them as his own creative work to clients, investors, or industry publications. I'd documented every instance meticulously, gathered irrefutable proof, and planned my response with the precision I brought to campaign analytics. Because what neither Richard nor these venture capitalists knew was that I'd already secured independent contracts with 4 major brands who wanted to work directly with me, been approached by 2 global advertising agencies about creative director positions, and consulted with attorneys who confirmed that my strategic frameworks and campaign materials were protected intellectual property that Richard had no legal rights to claim. In 72 hours, I would dissolve our agency partnership and reveal that every award-winning campaign Richard had been claiming credit for was actually my strategic work, backed by copyright documentation and client testimonials. His agency would lose its creative foundation, its major accounts, and its industry reputation. Mine would launch with the campaigns he'd tried to steal, proper attribution, and opportunities he'd blocked through his exploitation. Before we witness how a brilliant marketing strategist whose campaigns were stolen for years used documentation and industry connections to destroy her partner while launching her own successful agency, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes creative theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that strategic plagiarism should be exposed publicly. If you've had your marketing work stolen, if you've watched partners take credit for your campaigns, if you've been the invisible creative force behind someone else's agency success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome exploitation in creative industries. Now let's step into the world of digital marketing, where a talented strategist's work was systematically stolen by her charismatic business partner, where industry connections enabled exploitation, and where 22 months of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and creative triumph. My name is Jasmine Parker, and I'm a 32-year-old marketing strategist originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up in a family where my mother ran a successful public relations firm and my father taught communications at Emory University. Dinner conversations revolved around consumer behavior, brand narratives, and the psychology of persuasion. Marketing strategy felt like my native language from childhood. I learned about brand positioning when I was 12 years old, helping my mother prepare pitch decks for potential clients. She taught me about understanding target audiences, about crafting messages that resonated emotionally while driving action, about the difference between marketing that manipulated and marketing that genuinely connected. Those lessons shaped everything about how I approach strategic work. My mother's PR firm handled local and regional clients, and I absorbed her approach to understanding what motivated different consumer segments. She'd show me campaign materials and ask what I thought would resonate with specific demographics. She taught me to think about why people made purchasing decisions, what emotional needs brands could fulfill, how effective communication required deep empathy for audience perspectives. I remember one specific campaign when I was 14, watching my mother develop a rebranding strategy for a struggling restaurant chain. She spent weeks researching their customer base, conducting focus groups, analyzing competitor positioning. The resulting campaign increased their revenue by 40% in 6 months. Seeing that strategic thinking could transform business outcomes was profoundly influential. During high school, I ran social media for several student organizations and local small businesses. This was early in social media's commercial potential, and I experimented with different content strategies and engagement tactics. I discovered I had intuition for understanding what would resonate with different audiences on different platforms. The work felt like solving puzzles where the prize was genuine human connection. My father's academic background in communications theory provided intellectual framework for my practical marketing interests. He'd explain research about persuasion psychology, information processing, how people formed attitudes and made decisions. I learned about cognitive biases, heuristics, and the mechanisms underlying effective messaging. The combination of my mother's practical experience and my father's theoretical knowledge created comprehensive foundation for strategic thinking. I earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, studying integrated marketing communications at the Medill School. College was intellectually thrilling, learning from professors who were pushing boundaries of what strategic communication could accomplish in digital environments. I was particularly interested in how data analytics could inform creative strategy while maintaining authentic human connection. My sophomore year, I joined Northwestern's student advertising agency and led campaigns for real clients. We developed a social media strategy for a sustainable fashion startup that increased their online sales by 200% in 3 months. The campaign won student advertising awards and was featured in marketing publications as example of effective purpose-driven branding. The recognition validated my strategic approach. During junior year, I interned at a boutique agency in Chicago that specialized in startup marketing. The experience taught me about the intensity and creativity required in fast-paced entrepreneurial environments. I worked on launch campaigns for several tech startups, learning how to build brand awareness with limited budgets by focusing on authentic storytelling and strategic platform selection. My senior capstone project involved developing comprehensive marketing strategy for a social enterprise addressing food insecurity. The project combined data analysis, consumer research, content strategy, and campaign execution. The strategy earned departmental honors and caught attention of several agencies recruiting at Northwestern. The work demonstrated my ability to balance analytical rigor with creative vision. After graduation, I joined Weber Shandwick in New York, working my way from junior strategist to account lead over 5 years. The experience taught me about the business of marketing at scale, about managing complex client relationships, about coordinating across creative, media, and analytics teams. I contributed to campaigns for Fortune 500 clients, though always as part of larger teams where individual contributions weren't publicly attributed. My first major independent project at Weber Shandwick was a digital campaign for a financial services client trying to reach millennial consumers. Traditional financial advertising felt impersonal and intimidating to younger audiences. I developed a strategy focused on financial empowerment rather than traditional wealth messaging, using Instagram and TikTok to deliver educational content that felt supportive rather than condescending. The challenge was significant because millennials had experienced the 2008 financial crisis during formative years, creating deep skepticism about financial institutions. Many felt alienated by traditional banking marketing that assumed financial literacy they'd never been taught. The content needed to educate without patronizing, to build trust without appearing manipulative. I spent months researching millennial financial behaviors and anxieties. I conducted focus groups with 20-somethings about their banking experiences. I analyzed which financial content resonated on social media versus what felt like corporate propaganda. I discovered that millennials valued transparency, authenticity, and practical guidance over aspirational lifestyle marketing. The strategic framework I developed positioned the financial services brand as a supportive partner in financial education rather than a traditional bank selling products. The content strategy focused on bite-sized financial literacy delivered through relatable formats. Instagram posts explained budgeting concepts using everyday scenarios. TikTok videos demystified investment basics through humor and clear explanations. The tone was conversational and empowering rather than authoritative or condescending. I created detailed content calendars showing specific topics, platform-optimized formats, posting schedules, and engagement strategies. I developed partnership frameworks for working with financial literacy creators who had authentic relationships with millennial audiences. I established metrics focusing on engagement quality and educational impact rather than just reach or conversion. The campaign exceeded every performance metric. Engagement rates were 3 times industry average. Brand sentiment improved dramatically among the target demographic. Most importantly, account acquisition among millennials increased by 65% during the campaign period. Post-campaign surveys showed that participants felt the brand genuinely cared about their financial well-being rather than just selling products. The campaign won industry awards, though Weber Shandwick's creative director received primary credit while my contribution was acknowledged only internally. The award announcements credited the agency's leadership team with the innovative strategy, with my name appearing in fine print as one of multiple team members. This pattern of invisible contribution to award-winning work would repeat throughout my time at the agency. I worked on numerous high-profile campaigns during those 5 years, developing strategies that became signature elements of Weber Shandwick's portfolio. A purpose-driven campaign for a consumer goods company that authentically connected brand values with social impact, demonstrating how companies could support meaningful causes without appearing opportunistic. An influencer partnership framework for a beauty brand that felt genuine rather than transactional, focusing on long-term creator relationships instead of one-off paid posts. One campaign I'm particularly proud of involved repositioning a legacy technology company to appeal to younger enterprise buyers. The challenge was significant because the brand was perceived as outdated and corporate despite having innovative products. I developed a strategy that leveraged employee voices and customer success stories to humanize the brand while maintaining enterprise credibility. The content strategy featured real employees explaining complex technical concepts through accessible storytelling. Customer case studies showed tangible business outcomes rather than abstract technology features. The social media approach fostered community among users rather than broadcasting corporate messages. The rebrand successfully shifted perception among younger decision-makers while maintaining trust with existing clients. A content strategy for a tech company that made complex products feel accessible and human, using customer storytelling and practical use cases instead of technical specifications. The approach recognized that enterprise buyers were people making decisions under pressure, not just rational actors evaluating features. By addressing their actual concerns and decision-making contexts, the campaign achieved exceptional engagement and conversion rates. By my 4th year at Weber Shandwick, I'd become known internally as someone who could develop innovative strategies for challenging briefs. Senior leadership would assign me projects where traditional approaches had failed, where clients needed creative solutions to complex marketing problems. Clients specifically requested my involvement on their accounts after seeing work I'd contributed to previous campaigns. I was proud of these contributions, though frustrated by working within someone else's agency structure where credit and recognition were diffused across organizational hierarchies. I wanted to pursue my own vision for marketing that combined data-driven strategy with authentic human connection, to build campaigns that respected audience intelligence while driving measurable results. I wanted my own agency where I could fully express my strategic voice without filtering through multiple approval layers and competing creative philosophies. At 29, I decided to start my own marketing agency. I had strong strategic skills, proven track record of successful campaigns, and enough industry connections to make independence feasible. What I didn't have was client acquisition capabilities, established brand relationships, or the business infrastructure that new agencies needed to compete for major accounts. I met Richard Foster at an advertising industry conference in Miami. He was 41, charismatic and well-connected, with an MBA from Wharton and 15 years of experience in business development and agency operations. He approached me after my panel discussion about purpose-driven marketing, saying he'd been looking for a talented strategist partner to build an agency focused on authentic brand storytelling. We met for drinks that evening at the hotel bar. Richard talked enthusiastically about his vision for a boutique agency that could compete for premium clients while maintaining creative integrity. He said the market had strong demand for strategic marketing that felt genuine rather than manipulative, but that most agencies either sacrificed authenticity for scale or remained too small to serve major brands effectively. Richard explained his background in agency operations had taught him how corporate clients thought about marketing investments. He understood procurement processes, legal requirements, financial structures that made agencies attractive to enterprise clients. He knew how to position agency services to appeal to CMOs willing to pay premium rates for exceptional strategic work. He said this business acumen combined with my creative capabilities would create something unique. Over several meetings, Richard outlined how a partnership might work. He'd handle all business development, client acquisition, contract negotiation, and agency operations. I'd focus entirely on strategy, working with clients on campaign development and managing the creative aspects of client relationships. The division seemed perfect, allowing me to concentrate on strategic work while someone else handled aspects of agency management I found less engaging. Richard had connections to marketing executives at major brands, understood the business side of agencies, and could handle everything from client acquisition to financial management. He said my strategic talent combined with his business expertise would create a formidable partnership. The division of responsibilities seemed ideal. We formed Foster Parker Agency as a 50-50 partnership, both our names on the LLC documents. Richard handled initial business development while I focused on building our strategic frameworks and service offerings. We secured office space in a converted loft in Chelsea with the creative aesthetic that would appeal to potential clients. The setup felt professional and promising. The office featured exposed brick walls, standing desks, multiple collaboration spaces, and glass-walled conference rooms. Richard insisted on premium finishes and equipment, saying the environment needed to convey creativity and success to prospective clients. We installed large monitors for presenting campaign concepts, whiteboards covering entire walls for brainstorming, comfortable seating areas for client meetings. Richard hired an operations manager and administrative coordinator, bringing professional structure to the agency's day-to-day functions. He designed branding and marketing materials with sophisticated aesthetic. He set up the business infrastructure, established banking relationships, negotiated vendor contracts, created financial systems. The operational foundation appeared solid and professional. The early months were productive. I developed strategic frameworks for different campaign types we wanted to offer, creating a portfolio that showcased our agency's approach to authentic brand storytelling. Richard would review strategies and provide feedback, always enthusiastic about the work I was producing. He'd bring potential clients to the office to see my strategic thinking, presenting it as examples of what we could deliver. I created comprehensive strategy decks for various brand challenges that demonstrated our capabilities across different industries and platforms. A social media activation strategy for fashion brands wanting authentic influencer partnerships. A content marketing framework for B2B technology companies humanizing complex products. A brand repositioning approach for legacy companies trying to connect with younger consumers. A launch strategy for direct-to-consumer startups building communities around their products. I shared everything with Richard during this development phase, walking him through my strategic thinking, explaining the consumer insights and platform mechanics behind each approach. I thought we were partners building an agency together, that my openness about strategic decisions was normal collaboration between creative and business leadership. Richard would ask thoughtful questions during these reviews, showing genuine interest in understanding the strategic work. He'd inquire about why I'd chosen specific platforms, how I'd approached audience segmentation, what informed my decisions about content mix and campaign timing. I appreciated his engagement, interpreting it as a business partner learning enough about strategy to effectively represent our agency. The theft started subtly during client pitches. Richard would describe campaigns using language that subtly claimed creative credit. He'd say, "We developed," or "our strategy," when discussing work I'd created entirely on my own. He'd present strategic frameworks without clearly stating that I'd developed every insight and approach. At first, I told myself this was normal business communication, that Richard was using inclusive language to present us as a unified agency. But the pattern became troubling when he started taking pitch meetings without inviting me, returning with signed contracts for projects where clients thought Richard was the lead strategist. The first undeniable instance involved a fintech company launch campaign. The client was a well-funded startup creating a mobile banking app targeting Gen Z consumers. They needed comprehensive launch strategy including brand positioning, social media activation, influencer partnerships, and content marketing that would build trust with a demographic notoriously skeptical of financial institutions. I spent 3 months developing the campaign strategy. I conducted extensive research on Gen Z financial behaviors, interviewed 20-somethings about their banking frustrations, analyzed competitor positioning, studied which financial content resonated on different platforms. The resulting strategy was comprehensive and innovative, addressing the unique challenge of building trust in financial services through authentic peer education rather than traditional advertising. The strategic framework positioned the app as a financial empowerment tool created by people who understood their generation's economic anxieties rather than a banking product developed by out-of-touch financial institutions. The content strategy focused on financial literacy delivered through relatable creators rather than promotional messaging. The influencer partnership model emphasized genuine product use rather than paid endorsements. I created detailed documentation of every strategic element, including consumer research findings, platform-specific content calendars, influencer partnership criteria, budget allocation across channels, success metrics and KPIs, risk assessment and mitigation strategies. The complete strategy package represented months of specialized research and strategic development. Richard attended the pitch meeting with me, positioned as agency principal while I was introduced as head of strategy. During the presentation, I walked through the strategic framework, explaining the consumer insights and platform mechanics. The client asked sophisticated questions about the approach, and I provided detailed answers demonstrating deep understanding of their target audience. After the presentation, the client told us they were impressed with the strategy and wanted to move forward. They mentioned being particularly excited about Richard's innovative approach to authentic brand building and his understanding of Gen Z consumer psychology. I realized Richard had positioned himself as the strategic mind behind the campaign during pre-meeting conversations I hadn't been part of. 2 weeks later, Richard showed me the signed contract. The client had committed to a 6-month campaign with significant budget. Richard seemed pleased with the deal, saying the fintech launch would be perfect for establishing our agency's reputation for youth-focused digital strategy. But as he described the contract negotiation, I understood he'd claimed my strategic work as his creative vision. The theft escalated from there. Richard began scheduling client meetings without including me, presenting my strategic frameworks as his own thinking. He'd return with signed contracts and tell me about campaigns he'd sold using strategies I'd developed. He was performing strategic expertise he didn't actually possess, using my work to create an illusion of creative leadership. I started noticing patterns in how Richard described our agency to prospective clients and in industry contexts. He'd talk about his approach to consumer psychology and his framework for authentic brand storytelling when discussing campaigns I'd created entirely independently. He was building his professional reputation on my intellectual property while keeping me invisible. During one particularly frustrating pitch, Richard used strategy decks I'd created alongside a presentation describing his strategic philosophy and his innovative framework for social-first brand building. Every framework showed work I'd developed, Every consumer insight came from my research, every strategic decision reflected my thinking. But Richard spoke about it all as if these approaches originated with him. I confronted Richard after that pitch about claiming my strategic work as his creative vision. He looked at me with apparent confusion, as if my frustration was incomprehensible. He said that as partners in a marketing agency, all strategies were ours, regardless of who physically developed them. He said I was being territorial about work that belonged to the partnership we'd built together. The conversation became an argument about ownership, attribution, and what partnership meant in creative professional contexts. Richard insisted his business development and client relationships were equally valuable to my strategic work, that the agency's success was collaborative even if I'd physically created all the strategies. He said demanding individual credit undermined our partnership and made me seem difficult. I left that conversation feeling manipulated and diminished. Richard had taken a legitimate complaint about intellectual property theft and reframed it as my personal problem with sharing recognition. He'd made me question whether I was being unreasonable to expect acknowledgement for creating every strategy our agency had produced. That evening, I called a former professor from Northwestern who'd become a mentor, Professor David Chen. I described what was happening with Richard. He listened carefully, then told me something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. He said he'd seen this pattern before in creative agencies, business partners systematically claiming credit from talented strategists, keeping them invisible while building reputations on stolen intellectual property. Professor Chen emphasized that strategic frameworks and campaign materials were protected under intellectual property law. He explained that I could document my creative process, establish copyright on written materials, and prove authorship through comprehensive records. Most importantly, he said documentation would be crucial if I needed to leave the partnership and protect my work. He recommended I immediately start protecting my work legally and documenting that all strategies were mine. He suggested consulting with attorneys specializing in intellectual property and advertising, keeping comprehensive records of my strategic development process, and building relationships with clients independent of Foster Parker Agency so I'd have professional options if I needed to leave the partnership. Following Professor Chen's advice, I began systematically documenting my work. I kept detailed strategic journals describing my development process for every campaign. I saved all digital files with metadata showing creation dates and authorship. I photographed whiteboard sessions and strategy sketches with dates. I was building comprehensive evidence that would prove I'd created everything Richard was claiming as his strategic vision. I also started registering copyrights on written strategy materials and campaign frameworks. While ideas themselves couldn't be copyrighted, the specific expression of those ideas in strategic documents and campaign materials could be protected. I submitted comprehensive documentation to the Copyright Office establishing legal proof that I'd authored the strategic work. The documentation process required maintaining duplicate records of everything. I'd create strategy decks and frameworks on office computers, then save copies to personal drives with metadata intact. I'd forward myself emails containing strategic discussions. I'd photograph whiteboard strategy sessions before they were erased. I was building parallel archive proving my authorship. Simultaneously, I began building professional relationships independent of Richard and Foster Parker Agency. I attended industry events alone, joined professional organizations, made sure people in the marketing community knew me as an actual strategist rather than just Richard's business partner. I was establishing my own professional identity separate from the agency. One particularly valuable connection came through a women in advertising network I joined. Through this group, I met several successful women agency owners who'd faced similar credit theft earlier in their careers. They shared strategies for protecting work, advice about leaving exploitative partnerships, and encouragement that my concerns about Richard's behavior were legitimate and serious. One agency owner, Patricia Martinez, told me she'd left a partnership 8 years earlier after her partner had systematically claimed credit for her creative work. She'd struggled initially after leaving but had built a successful independent agency. She emphasized the importance of having comprehensive documentation and client relationships before confronting exploitation or dissolving partnerships. Patricia's story gave me both validation and strategic direction. I wasn't overreacting to Richard's behavior. I was recognizing a serious pattern of professional theft that required careful response. The documentation I was gathering wasn't paranoid but necessary protection of my intellectual property and creative work. During this documentation period, I also started having careful conversations with clients we'd worked with through Foster Parker Agency. I wanted to understand whether they knew I'd created the strategies Richard had been presenting as his work. The conversations were revealing and disturbing. Multiple clients told me they'd assumed Richard was the lead strategist because of how he'd presented himself in initial pitches and ongoing communications. They'd believed they were hiring Foster Parker Agency primarily for Richard's strategic vision. Several expressed surprise when I explained I'd actually developed their campaigns, saying Richard had certainly implied the strategies were his creative work. One client, the CMO of a consumer goods company we'd done a repositioning campaign for, was particularly frank. She told me she'd worked with Foster Parker Agency specifically because she was impressed with Richard's presentation about consumer psychology and authentic brand building. She'd assumed the strategic frameworks Richard showed were his own intellectual property. When I showed her my development documentation proving I'd created everything, she was shocked and visibly concerned. The CMO said she felt misled, that she'd signed contracts believing she was getting Richard's strategic expertise when in reality Richard had no strategic capabilities. She told me explicitly that if I left Foster Parker Agency and started my own agency, she'd want to work with me directly on future projects. She said several other marketing executives she knew would likely feel the same way. These conversations confirmed that Richard's credit theft wasn't just affecting my relationship with him but was damaging my professional reputation in ways that would impact my career long-term. Industry professionals thought he was the strategic talent behind our agency when in reality he couldn't develop a campaign strategy if his career depended on it. I also discovered that Richard had been submitting my work to advertising awards and industry publications under his name as creative director, with me listed only as strategist or account manager. 4 campaigns I'd developed had won regional advertising awards, and all 4 award announcements credited Richard Foster as the creative mind behind the work. My name appeared in fine print as a team member. The first award was for the FinTech Launch campaign, which won an Effie Award for marketing effectiveness. The award certificate listed Richard Foster as creative director and Jasmine Parker as strategist. The award announcement in advertising publications credited Richard's innovative approach to Gen Z financial marketing and his authentic brand building framework. The second award was for a sustainable fashion brand campaign I'd developed featuring micro-influencer partnerships focused on conscious consumption rather than promotional content. The campaign won recognition for purpose-driven marketing, again with Richard listed as creative director. Industry magazines ran features describing Richard's strategic philosophy and vision for authentic brand storytelling. The third award was for a tech company rebrand I'd developed that humanized complex B2B software through customer story content and employee advocacy. The campaign won awards for both creative excellence and business impact. Every recognition credited Richard as the strategic force behind the campaign, while I was mentioned only as supporting team member. The award credits were particularly galling because advertising awards significantly influenced professional reputation and career advancement. Richard was building an award-winning portfolio based entirely on my strategic work while keeping my contributions minimally acknowledged. The stolen credit would affect future opportunities, speaking invitations, and professional recognition. I started reaching out to the brands and clients who'd commissioned my strategies, explaining that I'd created the work they'd hired Foster Parker Agency to produce. I asked if they'd be interested in working with me directly if I left the partnership and started my own agency. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Multiple marketing executives said they'd absolutely work with me independently, that they'd been impressed with the strategic thinking and would follow the actual strategist rather than the business partner. One Fortune 500 CMO told me explicitly that he'd only worked with Foster Parker Agency because of my capabilities, that Richard's contribution seemed primarily administrative. I also received an unexpected call from Jennifer Walsh, managing director at Weeden plus Kennedy's New York office. Jennifer had seen my work at various industry events and been impressed with the strategic thinking attributed to Foster Parker Agency. She'd done some research and discovered that I'd actually created those strategies, and she wanted to discuss potential opportunities. Jennifer and I met for coffee at a cafe in Soho. She was direct and professional, saying Weeden plus Kennedy was expanding their brand strategy practice and looking for senior strategists with proven capabilities. She'd reviewed my work and thought my approach would align well with their creative culture and client base. The offer Jennifer eventually made was compelling. I'd join Weeden plus Kennedy as strategy director with clear path to creative director level, leading strategic development for major consumer brand accounts. I'd have significant creative autonomy, proper attribution for my work, and compensation that reflected my actual contributions rather than being split with a business partner who contributed nothing to strategy. But more tempting than joining another agency was the possibility of finally starting my own independent practice with the client relationships and documentation I'd been building. Several brands had committed to working with me directly. I had copyrights on my strategic frameworks and campaign materials. I had comprehensive evidence of Richard's fraud. The foundation for independence was stronger than I'd initially realized. I consulted with Michelle Thompson, an attorney specializing in advertising partnerships and intellectual property. Michelle reviewed all my documentation, including copyright registrations, strategic development records, and evidence of Richard's credit theft. She confirmed that I had strong legal grounds to dissolve the partnership and establish that Richard had no rights to strategies I'd created. Michelle explained that the partnership agreement Richard and I had signed didn't transfer intellectual property ownership to the partnership entity. Under copyright law, one retained ownership of creative works I'd developed unless I'd explicitly transferred those rights, which I hadn't. Richard had no legal claim to my strategies despite our business partnership. Michelle also pointed out that Richard's behavior potentially constituted fraud, misrepresenting his role in creating strategies when presenting to clients or submitting to awards competitions. If I wanted to pursue legal action beyond simply dissolving the partnership, I had grounds for claims related to his misrepresentation and damage to my professional reputation. The documentation I'd gathered was comprehensive enough that Michelle felt confident I could dissolve the partnership cleanly, retain rights to all my strategic work, and establish my own agency without legal complications. She recommended giving formal notice to Richard, clearly stating that I was leaving the partnership and retaining all intellectual property rights to strategies and campaigns I'd created. During the 22 months I spent documenting Richard's theft and building my exit strategy, the exploitation continued and escalated. Richard became increasingly brazen about claiming credit, seemingly confident that I wouldn't challenge him. Each instance of theft added to the evidence I was gathering while strengthening my resolve to leave. One particularly egregious example involved a campaign for a major athletic brand trying to authentically connect with women athletes. The client wanted strategy that would resonate with female consumers who were skeptical of traditional sports marketing that often felt performative or condescending. This required deep understanding of women's experiences in athletics and genuine commitment to representing those experiences authentically. I spent 5 months developing the campaign strategy. I interviewed women athletes across different sports and skill levels about their experiences. I analyzed which athletic brand content resonated authentically versus what felt like corporate pandering. I researched the history of women's sports marketing and the patterns that had eroded trust with female consumers. The resulting strategy was innovative and comprehensive. Instead of celebrity athlete endorsements, the campaign would feature everyday women athletes sharing unfiltered stories about their athletic journeys. Instead of aspirational imagery, the content would show the reality of training, failure, and perseverance. Instead of brand-centric messaging, the focus would be on building community around shared athletic experiences. The campaign framework included detailed content strategies for different platforms, partnership criteria for selecting athlete participants, brand integration guidelines that prioritized authenticity over promotion, success metrics focused on engagement quality rather than just reach, and risk mitigation strategies for maintaining authenticity at scale. Richard presented this campaign to the athletic brand's marketing leadership as his strategic vision. He gave a lengthy presentation describing his understanding of women's sports culture, his approach to authentic brand storytelling, his framework for community-driven marketing. Every insight he described came from my research and strategic work, but he presented it all as if these ideas originated with him. The client was impressed and signed a major multi-year contract based on Richard's presentation. They sent thank you emails addressed to Richard, praising his strategic thinking and cultural sensitivity. They had no idea I'd created everything Richard had shown them. Richard forwarded me the thank you notes with a message saying the campaign was a great win for our agency. Another major theft involved a sustainability campaign for a consumer packaged goods company trying to authentically communicate environmental commitments without appearing to greenwash. The challenge was significant because consumer skepticism about corporate sustainability claims was high, and the company had legitimate environmental initiatives but needed strategy to communicate them credibly. I developed a campaign strategy based on radical transparency rather than traditional environmental marketing. Instead of making broad sustainability claims, the campaign would show specific actions, acknowledge limitations, and invite consumer participation in environmental goals. The approach required vulnerability that most corporate marketing avoided but would build authentic credibility. The strategic framework included detailed content calendars showing behind-the-scenes footage of sustainability initiatives, partnership structures with environmental organizations to provide third-party validation, social media strategies for responding to skepticism transparently, employee advocacy programs showcasing genuine commitment, and measurement frameworks that tracked both environmental impact and consumer trust metrics. Richard presented this strategy at an industry conference in Chicago, giving a keynote about authentic sustainability marketing. He showed my strategic frameworks, described my research findings, and explained my approaches as if they were his own intellectual property. The presentation was recorded and posted online, creating permanent documentation of Richard claiming my creative work as his own. Conference attendees approached me afterward with questions, assuming I'd worked on Richard's strategies in some supporting role. When they asked technical questions about the frameworks, I found myself in the awkward position of explaining strategies I'd created while Richard received credit. The experience was professionally humiliating and clarifying. Richard wasn't going to stop stealing my work. I needed to leave. I also discovered Richard had been negotiating with marketing publications to position himself as a thought leader in authentic brand strategy. 3 major advertising magazines ran feature articles about Foster Parker Agency's work, with Richard photographed in the office and quoted extensively about strategic philosophy and creative process. The magazine articles described Richard's innovative approach to consumer psychology and his framework for authentic brand storytelling in digital environments. They showed photographs of him reviewing strategy documents at his desk, presenting to clients in conference rooms, speaking at industry events. The articles created comprehensive narrative of Richard as an accomplished strategist, with my role minimized to execution support. One article in Ad Age particularly stung. The feature showed 8 campaigns I'd developed with lengthy descriptions of Richard Foster's strategic vision. The writer had interviewed Richard extensively about his creative process, his influences, his approach to marketing strategy. Richard had described strategic decisions I'd made, explaining my reasoning as if it were his own thinking. I'd been interviewed briefly for the article as head strategist, asked only tactical questions about campaign implementation and performance metrics. My quotes appeared in sidebars as supporting content, while Richard's quotes formed the main narrative. The article cemented Richard's reputation as an innovative strategist while keeping me invisible. But every article, every award, every instance of credit theft also created more evidence. I saved all the publications showing Richard claiming credit for my work. I cross-referenced them with my copyright registrations and development documentation proving I'd created everything. I was building an airtight case that would expose Richard's fraud completely. Throughout this period, I maintained careful records of all communications with Richard. I saved emails where he presented my work to clients without attribution. I documented meetings where he described my strategies as his creative vision. I kept copies of contracts listing him as creative director on campaigns I'd developed. Every piece of evidence strengthened the case I was building. I also documented the emotional toll Richard's exploitation was taking. I kept a private journal describing how it felt to watch someone steal credit for years of strategic work, how frustrating it was to remain invisible while my campaigns won awards and recognition for someone else. The psychological impact was significant and cumulative. There were moments when I questioned my own perception. Richard's gaslighting was sophisticated enough that I sometimes wondered if I was overreacting to normal agency dynamics. Maybe claiming our strategy was just business communication. Maybe my desire for individual recognition was unreasonable in a partnership context. But then I'd look at my strategy journals, my original frameworks, my comprehensive documentation of creative process, and reality would reassert itself. I had created every strategy Foster Parker Agency had produced. Richard had contributed nothing to the creative work. His theft wasn't ambiguous partnership dynamics but deliberate fraud. After 22 months of careful preparation, I had everything I needed to leave the partnership and expose Richard's theft. I had copyright registrations on my strategic frameworks and campaign materials. I had comprehensive documentation of my creative process. I had commitments from multiple brands to work with me independently. I had legal advice confirming my rights. I had job offers providing backup options. Most importantly, I had absolute certainty that leaving was the right decision. I scheduled a meeting with Richard at our office on a Monday afternoon. I'd prepared everything carefully, consulting with Michelle Thompson about exactly how to handle the dissolution conversation. I had formal written notice of partnership dissolution. I had documentation proving my intellectual property ownership. I had copies of evidence showing his systematic credit theft. Richard seemed relaxed when I arrived at the conference room, probably assuming this was a routine business meeting. He had his laptop open, showing a strategy presentation he'd prepared for a potential client pitch later that week. The presentation, predictably, featured my strategic frameworks presented as his intellectual property. I sat down across from him and placed a folder on the table. The folder contained copies of copyright registrations for every major strategy and campaign Foster Parker Agency had created, all registered in my name with comprehensive documentation proving my authorship. It contained evidence of 17 instances where Richard had presented my work as his own to clients, publications, or industry contexts. It contained letters from brand executives confirming they'd work with me independently. I began speaking before Richard could start his typical meeting routine. I told him I was dissolving our partnership effective immediately. The words came out calmly and clearly. Richard's expression shifted from casual friendliness to confusion as he began processing what I'd said. "What are you talking about, Jasmine?" Richard asked, closing his laptop. "Dissolve the partnership? If you're concerned about something, we can discuss it like we always do. We've built something significant here together." I explained that I owned intellectual property rights to every strategy Foster Parker Agency had produced because I'd created them independently and never transferred ownership. I told him I'd documented his systematic misrepresentation of authorship and had legal counsel confirming his behavior constituted fraud. I pushed the folder across the table toward him. Richard opened the folder and began reviewing the contents. I watched his expression shift as he saw page after page of copyright registrations, all in my name, all dated over the past 22 months. He saw the documentation of instances where he'd claimed my work as his own, each with dates, sources, and evidence. He saw the letters from brand executives stating they'd work with me directly. "This is absurd," Richard said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "These are agency strategies. Everything we've created has been collaborative, part of building this business together. You can't just claim ownership of work that belongs to Foster Parker Agency." I told him that intellectual property law didn't work that way. I'd consulted with attorneys specializing in advertising and IP. Unless I'd explicitly transferred copyright ownership to the partnership entity, which I hadn't, I retained rights to creative works I'd produced. Richard had no legal claim to strategies I'd created, regardless of our business partnership structure. "I've contributed to these campaigns," Richard insisted, his tone becoming defensive. "I've brought in the clients, managed the business operations, made this agency possible. You're acting like I've done nothing, when in reality my business development has been essential to our success." I acknowledged that Richard had handled business operations, but pointed out that business development didn't entitle him to claim creative credit for work he hadn't created. His contribution was management, not strategy. He'd systematically misrepresented himself as the creative force behind campaigns I'd developed entirely independently, which constituted fraud. Richard tried several approaches as reality set in. He suggested we could restructure the partnership to give me more recognition. He proposed changing how we attributed work in presentations and publications. He offered to revise our partnership agreement to clarify intellectual property ownership. Each suggestion was a desperate attempt to prevent the dissolution he could see coming. I told him it was too late for restructuring or compromise. I'd spent nearly 2 years documenting his theft and building exit strategy because I'd lost all trust in the partnership. I explained that I'd already secured commitments from multiple brands to work with me independently, that I had legal protection for all my strategic work, and that I was launching my own agency regardless of what he proposed. "You're destroying everything we've built," Richard said, and I heard genuine emotion rather than business negotiation tactics. "Foster Parker Agency has reputation, client relationships, ongoing campaigns. You can't just walk away and take everything with you. What am I supposed to do?" I told him that Foster Parker Agency's reputation was built entirely on strategies I'd created, that the client relationships existed because of my work, and that ongoing campaigns were mine by intellectual property law. I explained that he'd have to figure out what to do without the strategic capabilities he'd been fraudulently claiming as his own for nearly 2 years. Richard's response shifted to anger. He accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting that he'd given me the opportunity to build an agency, of being vindictive and destructive. He said I was throwing away a successful partnership over ego and desire for individual recognition. His words were designed to make me feel guilty, to reframe legitimate complaints about intellectual property theft as my personal character flaws. I remained calm. I told Richard that he hadn't given me an opportunity but had exploited my creative work while keeping me invisible. I pointed out that every award, every publication feature, every recognition Foster Parker Agency had received was based on my strategies, which he'd systematically claimed as his own creative vision. "I thought we were partners," Richard said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like hurt. "I thought we were building something together. This feels like a betrayal of everything we've worked toward." I told him the betrayal had been his systematic theft of credit for my creative work. I explained that every time he'd presented my strategies as his own vision, every time he'd accepted awards for work I'd created, every time he'd given interviews describing strategic philosophy that came entirely from my research and thinking, he'd betrayed the partnership he claimed to value. I handed Richard formal written notice of partnership dissolution, drafted by Michelle Thompson. The notice specified that I was withdrawing from Foster Parker Agency effective immediately, retaining all intellectual property rights to strategies and campaigns I'd created, and establishing my own independent agency. The notice also warned that any attempt to use my strategic work after dissolution would result in copyright infringement claims and potential fraud lawsuits. I told Richard the first had no interest in protecting his reputation by maintaining fictions about collaborative work. I explained that I'd be contacting all clients, brand executives, and advertising publications to clarify that I'd created the strategies previously attributed to Foster Parker Agency or to him personally. His fraud would be exposed completely, and he'd face consequences for systematic intellectual property theft. Richard sat reading the notice, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He looked at the documentation I'd compiled, seeing comprehensive evidence of his fraud laid out clearly. He realized that I'd been planning this for nearly 2 years, that I had legal protection, client relationships, and evidence that would expose him completely if he tried to fight. The meeting ended with Richard understanding he had no options. He couldn't continue using my strategies because I owned the intellectual property. He couldn't claim the strategies were partnership property because copyright law didn't support that position. He couldn't maintain Foster Parker Agency's reputation because all its award-winning work was mine and would be leaving with me. His agency would collapse, and his fraud would be exposed. He was finished. I walked out of that office for the last time feeling both relief and vindication. The invisible strategist was stepping into visibility. The stolen strategies would be properly attributed. The exploiter would face consequences. And I was launching my own agency with the portfolio, client relationships, and legal protection I'd spent nearly 2 years building. Within 10 days, I established Parker Strategy Group with office space in Brooklyn. The space was smaller than Foster Parker's Chelsea loft but felt authentic and mine. I hung campaign materials on the walls with proper attribution. I met with brand executives who'd committed to working with me directly. I finalized contracts for 5 major campaigns that would launch my independent agency. The brands I'd been cultivating relationships with during my documentation period immediately transferred their business from Foster Parker Agency to Parker Strategy Group. The consumer goods company CMO signed a contract for a comprehensive brand refresh within days of my departure. The athletic brand, once they learned I'd actually created their campaign strategy, moved their account to my new agency. Within a month of leaving Foster Parker, I'd secured enough client commitments to make my independent agency financially viable. The executives who'd thought they were hiring Richard's strategic expertise realized they'd actually been getting mine, and they followed the actual strategist rather than the business partner who'd misrepresented his role. I also contacted all the advertising publications that had featured Foster Parker Agency's work. I provided them with copyright documentation proving I'd created the strategies attributed to Richard Foster. I explained that Richard had systematically misrepresented his role in creating campaigns, that he'd committed fraud by claiming credit for work he hadn't produced. Several publications ran correction articles or updates acknowledging that Jasmine Parker, not Richard Foster, had created the strategies previously attributed to Foster Parker Agency. Ad Age published a substantial correction explaining that their earlier feature article had misattributed creative credit, and they ran a new profile about my independent agency with accurate attribution. The advertising community response to my story was powerful and validating. Multiple strategists, particularly women and people of color, reached out saying they'd experienced similar credit theft in agency settings. Professional organizations invited me to speak about protecting intellectual property and preventing exploitation. The story resonated because creative theft was more common than most people acknowledged. Richard Foster's reputation collapsed completely. Once brand executives and industry professionals learned he'd been fraudulently claiming credit for my strategies, his credibility was destroyed. Foster Parker Agency lost every major client within 6 weeks. The executives who'd thought they were hiring Richard's strategic capabilities pulled their accounts. The referrals Richard had counted on disappeared. Several clients threatened legal action against Richard for misrepresentation, claiming they'd signed contracts based on false premises about his strategic capabilities. At least 3 brands pursued arbitration seeking to recover payments they'd made to Foster Parker Agency, arguing the contracts were fraudulent because Richard had misrepresented his role. Richard attempted to salvage his agency by hiring other strategists, but his reputation was so damaged that talented professionals refused to work with him. The advertising community understood he'd built his entire reputation on stolen intellectual property, and no strategist wanted to associate with someone who'd so thoroughly betrayed professional ethics. Within 4 months of my departure, Foster Parker Agency closed completely. Richard dissolved the LLC, unable to maintain the business without any strategic capabilities or client relationships. The office space was vacated, the website went dark, and Richard Foster disappeared from New York's advertising community. I heard through professional networks that Richard had left advertising entirely, moving to another city and changing careers. His attempt to build reputation and success by stealing my creative work had backfired completely, destroying the career he'd tried to create fraudulently. Meanwhile, Parker Strategy Group flourished. My first year of independent practice exceeded every expectation. I completed campaigns for 9 major brands, won 4 advertising awards properly attributed to me, and was invited to speak at industry conferences. The professional recognition I'd been denied while Richard stole credit for my work came flooding in once I had proper attribution. The fintech launch campaign I'd developed, which Richard had previously claimed as his work, became a case study featured in marketing publications and business schools. This time the articles credited Jasmine Parker as strategist, describing my approach to Gen Z financial marketing and authentic brand building. The campaign won multiple industry awards, with my name on every certificate and in all announcements. The athletic brand campaign for women athletes launched to critical acclaim, featured in both advertising and sports media. The campaign achieved exceptional engagement metrics and measurably improved brand perception among female consumers. Every article and award credited my strategy, establishing my reputation for culturally authentic marketing that genuinely resonated with underserved audiences. Within 2 years of leaving Foster Parker, Parker Strategy Group had worked with over 20 major brands and won 12 advertising awards. My work was featured regularly in industry publications, always with proper attribution. I'd established reputation as one of the industry's most innovative strategists, recognition that reflected my actual contributions rather than being stolen by a fraudulent business partner. The financial success matched the professional recognition. Independent practice was more profitable than partnership with Richard had been, because I wasn't splitting revenue with someone who contributed nothing to the agency's strategic capabilities. My overhead was lower, my margins were better, and every dollar earned reflected my actual work. I also began advocacy work helping other strategists and creatives protect their work and avoid exploitation I'd experienced. I developed resources about intellectual property protection for marketing professionals, wrote articles about preventing credit theft in agency partnerships, and mentored young strategists about protecting their creative contributions. The American Marketing Association invited me to present at their national conference about intellectual property rights and proper attribution in creative work. My session drew one of the largest audiences, indicating how many professionals had experienced or worried about credit theft. Multiple attendees approached me afterward saying my story had encouraged them to protect their own work or leave exploitative situations. I also worked with Professor Chen at Northwestern to develop curriculum about intellectual property protection for marketing students. We created a course covering copyright law, documentation strategies, partnership agreements, and case studies of creative theft and protection. The course became required for all marketing communications students, teaching future professionals to protect their work from the beginning of their careers. 5 years after leaving Foster Parker, I'm 37 and running one of New York's most respected boutique marketing agencies. Parker Strategy Group has worked with over 40 major brands, won 18 advertising awards, and established reputation for strategic work that combines data-driven insights with authentic human connection, properly attributed to actual creator. The professional success vindicated my decision to leave Richard's exploitation. Every award with my name, every publication crediting my strategies, every brand hiring me for my capabilities represented visibility Richard tried to deny me. My advocacy work extended beyond personal success to helping other creatives facing credit theft. I provided free consultations to strategists discovering their partners were stealing credit, helping them document their work and exit exploitative situations. I mentored dozens of young professionals about protecting intellectual property in creative partnerships. One young strategist I mentored, Aisha Williams, had been working at an agency where the creative director was systematically claiming credit for her campaign concepts. Using strategies I'd shared about intellectual property protection and documentation, Aisha gathered evidence of the theft, registered copyrights on her work, and left to establish her own boutique agency. She's now running a successful practice with proper attribution for her creative work. Another strategist, Marcus Chen, contacted me after discovering his business partner had been submitting Marcus's strategies to awards competitions under the partner's name. I helped Marcus understand his intellectual property protections, connect with attorneys, and document the theft. Marcus dissolved the partnership and launched an independent consultancy that's thriving with proper recognition for his strategic capabilities. These success stories multiplied as more creatives learned about protecting their work and refusing to accept invisible exploitation. Each person who left an exploitative situation and succeeded independently strengthened the message that intellectual property theft deserved serious consequences and that talented professionals could thrive with proper attribution. 7 years after dissolution, Foster Parker Agency was completely forgotten except as cautionary tale in advertising circles. Richard had faded into complete obscurity, his attempt to build a career on stolen work having destroyed any credibility he might have had. And I was thriving with proper recognition, using my platform to continue fighting for creatives' rights and proper attribution. 10 years after leaving, I published a book combining marketing strategy with practical advice about protecting creative intellectual property. The book became assigned reading in advertising programs, widely adopted for professional practice courses. It covered copyright law, documentation strategies, partnership agreements, and real-world examples of creative theft and protection. Richard's fraud became a teaching case in the book, his exploitation immortalized as a cautionary tale educating future generations about protecting creative work. He had wanted to be remembered as an innovative marketing strategist. Instead, he became an example of what not to do, the partner whose intellectual property theft destroyed his career while elevating his victim to greater success. My nieces are growing up seeing their aunt as a successful agency owner, author, and advocate using her platform to help others. The lessons from my experience with Richard are applicable beyond advertising to any situation where someone tries claiming credit for others' creative work. 15 years after Foster Parker dissolution, I received the Advertising Hall of Fame recognition for both strategic excellence and advocacy for proper attribution in creative industries. The ceremony included a retrospective of my career emphasizing how I'd transformed personal experience of intellectual property theft into broader movement for creatives' rights. The recognition validated that my response to Richard's exploitation had created positive outcomes beyond personal vindication. His theft catalyzed advocacy, helping hundreds of creatives protect their work and achieve proper recognition. The invisible strategist became a celebrated professional and advocate. The stolen strategies were properly attributed and award-winning. The exploiter left advertising discredited. And the industry became measurably more aware that creative theft deserved serious consequences. That's the ultimate outcome when exploitation meets someone talented enough to succeed independently, strategic enough to document and plan carefully, and committed enough to transform personal justice into advocacy benefiting others. Stolen credit was restored. Fraud was exposed. The exploiter was destroyed. And advertising became measurably better because one person refused to accept invisible exploitation.